The man known to history as Thomas Edison was born as Thomas Alva Edison in the town of Milan in the state of Ohio on the 11th of February, 1847. Thomas's father was Samuel Ogden Edison Jr. He was born in Digby in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1804. In 1811, the Edisons settled in Ontario and eventually would own an estate of more than 2,000 acres in Bayham Township, close to the northern shore of Lake Erie. In September 1828, the 24-year-old Samuel Edison Jr. married Nancy Matthews Elliott from New York State. She was the 17-year-old daughter of a Continental Army veteran of the American Revolutionary War. In 1837, Samuel took part in William Lyon Mackenzie's ill-fated attempt to overthrow the colonial government in Canada. Samuel was forced to flee to the United States, arriving first in Port Huron in Michigan, before eventually making his home in Milan, Ohio, in 1838. Samuel and Nancy would have 7 children, of which Thomas was the youngest. Thomas's great-grandfather, John Edison, had arrived in New Jersey as a 3-year-old from the Netherlands. Although Thomas would later claim that his great-grandfather was a Wall Street banker who supported the American Revolution, John was in fact a landowner who remained loyal to the British Crown, and in 1784, following the end of the American Revolutionary War, he became one of the tens of thousands of British loyalists in the 13 colonies who relocated to live in Canada following the American Revolutionary War. There, the family name began to be spelled Edison. Thomas Alva Edison, nicknamed Little Al by his family, grew up at a time of great political and economic change in the United States. The 1830s had been dominated by the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who presented himself as the champion of the American people against the corrupt political and financial elites in Washington and New York. While Jackson's Democratic Party believed that economic prosperity was down to the entrepreneurial spirit of individuals, his opponents in the Whig Party argued that the federal government had a role in promoting interstate commerce to foster economic prosperity, which, in turn, would strengthen the nation against its external rivals, like Britain. While the Whigs represented the established commercial centers in the Northeast, the Jacksonians encouraged westward expansion, resulting in the expansion into places like Alabama and Mississippi, leading eventually to the annexation of Texas in 1844 and the conquest of a large swathe of territory westwards to California and Oregon following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Behind the debates about westward expansion and economic development lay the issue of slavery, which, despite the efforts of Congress to stifle debate in an effort to preserve national unity, would rise to the top of the political agenda in the 1850s, eventually leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. Edison would grow up against the backdrop of this latter war. While all of this was occurring, great technological change was also underway, with the innovations of the Industrial Revolution that had begun in England in the 1770s finally making their way to the United States in the early 19th century. Edison would grow up in a period when thousands of kilometers of railway line were being laid down crisscrossing America, factories were being built in great numbers in cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, Ohio, and Philadelphia, and every year brought new technological breakthroughs. Most accounts of Thomas Edison's childhood include a series of apocryphal tales about his youthful curiosity and his desire to understand natural processes. One tells of young Thomas wandering into the fields and sitting on a goose egg in an attempt to hatch the egg after seeing a hen accomplish the same feat with one of her eggs. Although he was mocked by his brother-in-law, Homer Page, a local farmer, Al's sister Marion was far more understanding and praised her brother's curiosity about how things in the world worked on a technical level. The town of Milan had benefited from the construction of the Milan Canal, which was completed in 1839 and allowed the town to become a wealthy grain port, trading directly with New York City via Lake Erie and the Erie Canal. The 1840s and 1850s saw a boom in railroad construction in the United States, but several proposals to build rail links to Milan came to nothing due to opposition from the Milan Canal Company. As the grain trade shifted towards rail, economic activity at Milan declined, and in 1854, Samuel Edison Jr. decided to move his family to the familiar terrain of Port Huron. Little Al was enrolled in a local school, but he was largely homeschooled after a time by his mother, who had been a school teacher herself years earlier. Thomas was a sickly child and had hearing problems from a young age, perhaps the result of suffering from a bout of scarlet fever when he was 11 or 12 years old. His poor health and homeschooling led him to become an avid reader. Edison later recalled the influence that the writings of Thomas Paine, the egalitarian English philosopher, who was one of the most eloquent champions of American liberty prior to the American Revolution, had on him. He was also interested in history, but it was a science textbook by the title of A School Compendium of Natural and Experimental Philosophy that encouraged him to carry out his first experiments. Before long, the accumulation of chemical substances in the Edison house led Nancy to ask her son to conduct his experiments in the basement, which became the future inventor's first laboratory. Thomas Edison grew up at a time when young boys were expected to work at an early age. In 1859, at the age of 12, he secured his first job selling newspapers and refreshments on board the trains of the Chicago, Detroit, and Grand Trunk Junction Railway between Port Huron and Detroit. The young Edison took advantage of extended layovers in Detroit to broaden his reading horizons and discovered Isaac Newton's The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, one of the most important texts in the early development of the modern discipline of physics and the hard sciences. Edison also read extensively from the books and newspapers he was selling, and he noticed that there was limited coverage of local news. In 1862, the 15-year-old Edison launched his first entrepreneurial venture when he set up his own local newspaper, the Grand Trunk Herald, which he sold on board the train. The weekly paper ran for 24 issues in the first 6 months of 1862. At its peak, Edison was selling 200 copies a day. The money he made enabled him to employ 2 other boys to help him sell his papers. His entrepreneurial spirit went even further, and he soon opened a vegetable stand at Port Huron, where he sold produce from his father's farms as well as items bought at wholesale prices from farmers along the train line. As he entered his mid-teens, Edison abandoned the use of his childhood nickname of Al and let it be known that he preferred to be called Tom. His venture into journalism was an early demonstration of his interest in the dissemination of information. This was also reflected in his curiosity about the telegraph system, a new device invented in the late 1830s which enabled messages, made up of electrical pulses, to be sent along a wire. Telegraph posts were soon being established alongside the railways which were being built all over Europe, North America, and other regions, and so Edison, in his early work on the trains, had many opportunities to observe the telegraph operators at work. He soon mastered Morse code, the system of dots and dashes converted to short and long pulses developed by the telegraph's inventor, Samuel Morse, to transmit messages between telegraph stations. According to Edison's later account, in the autumn of 1862, he was talking to J. U. Mackenzie, the station master of the Mount Clements depot on the Grand Trunk Railway, when the latter's 3-year-old son wandered into the path of an oncoming train. Tom Edison leapt onto the tracks and rescued the young child. In gratitude, Mackenzie agreed to teach Tom how to operate a telegraph. Within 3 months, Tom had mastered the skill, and for the next few years of his life, he would work as a telegraph operator on several railroads in Ontario, Michigan, and Indiana. He later claimed that his hearing difficulty was a blessing in disguise, as he would only be able to hear the message at his own desk, while his colleagues had to deal with the distractions caused by the background noise of messages being received through other wires. He enjoyed working night shifts, as this enabled him to read and experiment during the day. By 1864, Tom was working for Western Union, initially based in Indianapolis and later in Cincinnati, where he began experimenting on ways to send multiple messages using a single wire. By the time he was promoted to first-class operator with a salary of $125 a month, the American Civil War had ended, and Edison went to the southern states, claiming to have re-established telegraph connections between Memphis, Tennessee, and New York City. In 1866, he moved on to Western Union's office in Louisville in Kentucky, where he spent a year as a wire reporter. He soon returned to Cincinnati, where he frequently took time off work to consult library books. While most of these were about telegraphy, the most important was the work of English scientist Michael Faraday, whose research would have a major impact on the subsequent commercial application of electricity in the second half of the 19th century. By early 1868, Edison was working in Western Union's office in Boston as a wire receiver. It was around this time that he began to meticulously record his breakthroughs in his experiments in his notebook, and also by sending his findings to trade journals, which enabled him to claim ownership of the ideas. In June 1869, Edison was issued patent US number 90,646 for an electric vote recorder based on telegraph technology, the first of over 1,000 patents he would receive during a 6-decade career as an inventor. Although his vote recorder generated little interest among the legislators it was intended to serve, Edison soon resigned from Western Union in order to devote his full energies to experimentation and invention. Not long after this, he developed an alphabetical dial telegraph network in Boston, which enabled operators to send messages by spelling out words rather than tapping them in Morse code. He hoped to build a duplex telegraphic line across New York State from Rochester to New York City, but the tests proved unsuccessful. Nevertheless, in 1869, he moved to New York City, where he briefly held a job as superintendent of the Gold and Stock Reporting Company. In 1870, after securing new financial backing to develop a faster automatic telegraph, Edison moved to New Jersey. Here, at just 23 years of age, he was managing a team of over 50 staff at the Newark Telegraph Works. There, his precocious career rise and prematurely graying hair earned him the nickname the Old Man. These were also years of personal change for him. After receiving news of his mother's death in April 1871, Thomas returned to Port Huron to attend the funeral. Later that year, Edison met Mary Stilwell, a 16-year-old employee at his subsidiary, the News Reporting Telegraph Company. The pair married not long afterwards on Christmas Day 1871. Edison's capacity to work long hours and his disregard for the 24-hour day led him to neglect his young wife. They had 3 children: Marion, born in 1873, Thomas Jr., born in 1876, and William, born in 1878. Mary would die in 1884 at just 29 years of age. The exact circumstances are unclear. She possibly had a brain tumor, and this led to her excessive use of morphine, with her death possibly being from opiate poisoning. All of that lay in the future. At Newark, in the early 1870s, Edison's closest collaborator was the Englishman Charles Batchelor, who joined him as his chief experimental assistant in the summer of 1873. Edison's machines were in high demand, and he constantly sought ways to improve their efficiency, producing sketches of the ideas and concepts that emerged from his fertile mind, which Batchelor converted into technical drawings for the workers to manufacture prototypes from. Edison's primary interest remained multiplex telegraphy, the ability to send multiple telegraphic messages along a single wire. Although he had been beaten to a commercially viable duplex telegraph system in 1872, he successfully developed a quadruplex telegraph in 1874, enabling 4 messages to be transmitted simultaneously. Although Edison began investigating multiplex telegraphy at Western Union, he was offered $30,000 by Jay Gould of the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company for his design, a huge sum by the standards of the time, which went some way to making him financially independent. In 1876, Edison, who had already been looking for larger premises for his family and his work, decided to acquire a house and 2 tracts of land at the nearby village of Menlo Park for $5,200. Edison's father, Samuel, supervised the construction here of a laboratory near the house. In the period that followed, as part of their experimentation with communications technology, Edison and Batchelor invented the electric pen, which enabled the user to create several copies of the same document or drawing as the movement of the needle-tipped pen created a stencil by piercing small holes into a piece of paper. A patent for the invention was filed in March 1876 and became a great commercial success, selling at $35 each. Although Edison was formally an employee of Atlantic Telegraph at this time, he continued to receive financial support behind the scenes from Western Union to work on a speaking telegraph, or a means to transmit the human voice through a wire. Although Alexander Graham Bell created the first working telephone in March 1876, the same device was used for speaking and listening, and the user had to shout into it in order to be heard by the receiver. Edison was convinced that there was a way to enhance the sound quality, and he spent the next 2 years experimenting with various materials by clenching his teeth around a metal plate which would enable the vibrations to travel through his jawbone. In 1877, Edison improved upon Bell's telephone by adding carbon buttons that enabled the sound to be transmitted with greater clarity. While Edison did not invent the telephone, his innovations improved the device and further fueled the success of the Menlo Park enterprise. At around this time, Edison was also working on a method to record sound, not just transmit it. By July 1877, he was able to record the vibrations of the human voice onto paper and then have it transmitted back using the coded vibrations. He began calling the device the phonograph. However, Edison was not able to find a method that allowed him to play back the sound until November, when he decided to use tin foil wrapped around a cylinder as his recording medium. Although Edison's phonograph could only record 10 seconds of sound, allowing him just enough time to record the nursery rhyme, "Mary Had a Little Lamb," a demonstration of the device in New York City at the office of the Scientific American Journal in December caused a sensation. Edison's success in reproducing the human voice earned him the nickname the Wizard of Menlo Park. Edison now set up the Edison Speaking Phonograph Company and had his agents give demonstrations of the device throughout the country. In April 1878, he gave a private demonstration to President Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House. Although most of the public regarded Edison's invention as a fun magic trick, in a journal article about the applications of the phonograph, Edison anticipated recorded music, audiobooks, and many other devices. After the phonograph had been initially developed, Edison turned his attention to the issue of electrical lighting. By the mid-19th century, most homes were well lit at night in countries like the United States, but this was achieved through sophisticated lamps that burned whale oil and other substances. Edison and many others were working on new ways to achieve this, which would remove naked flames from homes and end the large urban fires which were constantly in the newspapers as occurring across the country, notably the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871 that had destroyed large parts of the city. With the financial backing of Grosvenor Lowry, General Counsel to Western Union and Edison's personal legal advisor, the Edison Electric Light Company was incorporated in 1878 with a mission to own, manufacture, operate, and license the use of various apparatus used in producing light, heat, or power by electricity. The first experiments in electric lighting had begun by the British inventor Sir Humphry Davy at the beginning of the century, but 7 decades of experimentation by scientists had not yet resulted in a commercially viable product. The 1870s witnessed considerable interest in arc lighting, which consisted of 2 carbon rods separated by an insulating layer of plaster which lighted up with the introduction of an electrical current. However, as arc lamps were too bright and often had to be replaced as the insulating plaster burned away, they were not suitable for indoor use. On a visit to the Ansonia Brass and Clock Works in Connecticut in September 1878, where he saw a dynamo that distributed electricity power into a series of 8 arc lights, Edison became convinced that it was possible to build a city-wide network of electric lights from a single generator. Edison's experiments focused on incandescent lighting, and he sought a material for a filament that could burn for a long time without losing the intensity of its light. He hired the mathematician Francis Upton to collect all the existing literature on arc and incandescent lighting, both to inform his own experiments and to serve as a benchmark for the performance of his creations. Edison and Upton determined on the basis of their research that a long-lasting incandescent light bulb would need a platinum filament, a vacuum inside the bulb to prevent the filament from deteriorating as it reacted with the air, and a regulator that would enable a circuit of lights to remain at the same intensity even if one of them were to fail. By the spring of 1879, Edison had managed to power a circuit of 18 lamps, but he remained a long way from realizing his dreams of lighting up New York City with electricity. By the autumn, Edison decided to replace the platinum filament with carbon, which was much cheaper, and in October he produced a bulb that glowed for 13.5 hours. A few days later, Edison managed to keep a light going for over 100 hours. Edison had finally created a product which he believed would replace the dangerous and environmentally damaging gas light at a fraction of the cost. As with the phonograph 2 years earlier, visitors once again flocked to Menlo Park in order to see the laboratory lit up at night with Edison's incandescent lamps. Although he had been issued with a patent for his new design, Edison had not yet won the race to commercialize electric lighting. Across the Atlantic in England, the chemist Joseph Swan had been experimenting with incandescent lighting since the 1850s and held a public demonstration of a working filament bulb in February 1879, several months before Edison's breakthrough. Although he managed to install his lights at Cragside, the country house of his friend William Armstrong, Swan's light bulbs had a much shorter lifespan than Edison's. Throughout his life as an inventor, Edison believed that what mattered was not who came first, but whose product was the best. After a brief period of competition and litigation between Edison and Swan's companies in England, the two merged in 1883 to create the Edison and Swan United Electric Light Company, commonly known as Ediswan. A similar conflict played out in England between Edison and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone companies before their 1880 merger to form United Telephone Company of Great Britain. Edison would face a much tougher challenge realizing his plans for the electrification of New York City. In order to facilitate his lobbying efforts, he moved his electric lighting operations to Fifth Avenue and incorporated the Edison Electric Illuminating Company of New York. In the meantime, Edison dispatched his trusted lieutenant, Charles Batchelor, to establish the Edison Company's commercial interests in Europe. At the International Electrical Exhibition in Paris in August 1881, Batchelor secured 2 large rooms to exhibit all of Edison's products, including incandescent lights, phonographs, and telephones, while his associates ran an expensive public relations campaign designed to promote Edison's system in the French national press. Edison won 5 gold medals, and Batchelor secured an offer to provide the lighting for the foyer of the Paris Opera. The theatre of La Scala in Milan soon followed suit with an order for 3 Edison chandeliers. In London, other Edison associates were busy rigging up a lighting system powered by a coal-fired generator at Holborn Viaduct near the junction with Farringdon Street, which enabled him to light up the General Post Office building at Mount Pleasant. The work of the Edison Company in London informed Edison's plans to build a power station at Pearl Street in Manhattan. In order to protect his electrical wires from the elements, Edison opted to run them underground, and by the summer of 1882, buildings in New York's financial district began to light up with Edison's incandescent lamps. In September, Edison then personally switched on the lights at the offices of the banker J.P. Morgan, a shareholder of the Edison Company. Edison's power plants soon began to appear throughout America, and his European subsidiaries likewise built out a network of over 150 power plants. He entrusted the operations of the Pearl Street station to a young electrical engineer by the name of John William Lieb, whom he sent to Milan the following year as chief electrician of the Italian Edison Company. This soon became the largest electrical utility company in Europe. Despite the death of his first wife in 1884 and the changes to his personal circumstances with 3 young children to raise himself now, Edison soon signed a contract with the Bell Telephone Company of Boston to work on enhancements to the design of the telephone. The deal led him to resume his working relationship with Ezra Gilliland, a former Western Union colleague in Cincinnati who was now leading the Bell Company's telephone experimental department. In late 1884, Edison accompanied Gilliland to the World Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans, where he met the agricultural industrialist Lewis Miller of Akron, Ohio, and his 19-year-old daughter, Mina. In early 1885, Edison and his daughter Marion joined the Gillilands on a trip to Florida. In March, Edison visited the small town of Fort Myers on the western coast and decided to buy a 13-acre plot of land where he could spend his winters carrying out experiments. After returning to New York, Edison was determined to find a new wife to help him take care of his 3 children. He remained in correspondence with Mina Miller over the course of the year, and by July was determined to marry her, despite being twice her age. At the end of September, he sent a letter to Lewis Miller asking for permission to marry his daughter, which was readily granted. Mina's mother was less enthusiastic, but the couple were married anyway in Akron on the 24th of February 1886. Before their wedding, the couple were looking for a more spacious house, and in January 1886, Edison purchased the mansion of Glenmont in West Orange, New Jersey, for $125,000 in a liquidation sale. Edison considered the house a wedding gift to his new bride, though formal ownership did not pass to Mina until 1891. After the wedding, the couple initially spent their honeymoon in Fort Myers, though they were initially obliged to stay at a hotel, as Edison's house, christened Seminole Lodge, was not yet ready to accommodate them. Following the honeymoon, the couple moved to Glenmont, and Mina found herself struggling to manage the household as the 20-year-old stepmother of 3 children with a husband who spent long hours at his lab. In 1888, Mina gave birth to a daughter named Madeline. 2 more sons followed. Charles Edison, born in 1890, would serve a 3-year term as governor of New Jersey in the 1940s, and Theodore, born in 1898, who followed in his father's footsteps as an inventor. In May 1886, Edison encountered a problem of a different kind for the first time. Previously, he was used to dealing with technical and scientific problems, but this was one of a more human kind: labor strikes. This was an era in which socialist movements were gaining momentum across Europe and the Americas, fueled by dreadful working conditions and demands for workers to work 60 or 70 hours a week for meager wages. Edison's workers were struggling to keep up with consumer demand for electricity generators and walked out in protest at their long hours. He resisted the demands for unionization and decided to consolidate his manufacturing operations and move them out of the city. The Edison United Manufacturing Company set up a factory in Schenectady in upstate New York as Edison became the latest in a long line of American industrialists during the Gilded Age who resisted calls for progressive workers' rights. At the end of the year, Edison was ill with pleurisy and went to Fort Myers to recuperate. When he had recovered in early 1887, he supervised the construction of the laboratory at West Orange, now part of the Thomas Edison Historical Park. The previous year, Ezra Gilliland had appealed to Edison to turn his attention back to the phonograph. Despite an initial reluctance, based on the advances made by the Bell Company during the intervening decade, in 1887, Edison decided to form a new company, the Edison Phonograph Company, determined to make a better machine than Bell's. However, by giving Gilliland the responsibility of marketing his new phonographs in return for a 15% share of the profits, Edison had unwittingly created a rival. As Edison struggled to secure financial backing for his second-generation phonograph, which would employ a wax cylinder, the venture capitalist Jesse Lippincott attempted to consolidate the entire industry by negotiating with Gilliland and Edison's attorney, John Tomlinson, behind Edison's back. Edison felt betrayed by his associates and pursued costly litigation to consolidate his control over the market in opposition to Lippincott. While Edison's primary focus was the second-generation phonograph, by 1888 he was channeling his energies into a protracted public relations war with Nikola Tesla, a young rival from Europe who had made his home in the United States over the best and safest method of distributing electricity. A Croatian-born Serb, Tesla was a firm promoter of the alternating current system, widely known by its abbreviated name AC today, which enabled electricity to be transmitted over long distances of hundreds of miles at a high voltage, in contrast to Edison's direct current system, which operated at a low voltage and could only distribute power within a radius of 1 mile. Despite his ideological opposition to Edison, Tesla joined one of Edison's subsidiaries in Paris in 1882 and soon came to the attention of Charles Batchelor. In 1884, when Batchelor returned to New York City, Tesla accompanied him and began repairing dynamos at one of Edison's workshops. While Edison recognized Tesla's talents and praised his ideas, he privately believed that they were unrealistic. Within months of his arrival in the United States, Tesla left the Edison Company and formed the Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing Company, but was soon left penniless when his investors abandoned him. In 1888, Tesla made a major breakthrough in developing an AC motor. The development of transformers in the mid-1880s enabled AC voltages to be changed, making it possible to send AC electricity at a high voltage over long distances before bringing the voltage down at the destination to serve end users. Tesla's motor attracted the attention of the businessman George Westinghouse, who was developing AC infrastructure via his company, Westinghouse Electric. After Tesla joined forces with Westinghouse, Edison launched a bitter campaign highlighting the dangers of AC electricity. In one demonstration, Edison invited journalists to the courtyard of the West Orange laboratory to witness the execution of animals with AC electricity in a process he described as electricide, death by electricity. Edison also saw an opportunity to discredit Westinghouse when he was approached by New York electrical engineer Harold Brown, who had been instructed by the governor of New York to develop an electric chair for the execution of criminals. In conjunction with Thomson-Houston, Westinghouse's AC rival, Edison ensured that the electric chair carried a Westinghouse generator, and Edison's lawyer attempted to popularize the term Westinghouse to describe execution by electric chair in an effort to further sully Westinghouse, Tesla, and AC electricity in general. In 1889, J.P. Morgan approached Edison with a plan to merge all of Edison's electric companies into the Edison General Electric Company. In 1892, Edison merged with Thomson-Houston to form General Electric, which controlled 3/4 of the American electrical industry and brought Westinghouse to the brink of bankruptcy. The current war between Edison and Westinghouse had certainly brought out the less pleasant and more ruthless streak in Edison. In August 1889, Edison and Mina went to Paris to attend the Universal Exhibition. While the event is best known for the inauguration of the Eiffel Tower, a controversial creation at the time that was initially intended to be a temporary structure, the Edison Pavilion was also a popular attraction. Here, Edison demonstrated his designs and inventions. His new design for the phonograph attracted over 30,000 visitors in a month. Edison was acknowledged as an international celebrity in France, and in September, he was entertained by the composer Charles Gounod in the private salon of Gustave Eiffel, the designer of the famous tower, at the top of the tower, which Edison praised as a symbol of modernity. On a visit to the Paris Opera, Edison was given the honor of watching the performance from the presidential box. Edison's products required a supply of high-quality metals, and the lack of high-quality iron ore in the eastern United States forced American industry on the eastern seaboard to rely on expensive ore from the Midwest and from as far afield as Cuba and Spain. Since the late 1870s, Edison had been trying to extract metal from lower-quality ore. He developed a method to extract iron from beach sand using a powerful electromagnet and formed the Edison Ore Milling Company in 1881, but the company closed after 3 years after its operations failed to make a profit. In the late 1880s, Edison renewed his interest in this endeavor, this time focusing on developing machines to make low-quality ore into fine material before separating the metallic and non-metallic elements with magnets. Edison acquired a mine at Bechtelsville in Pennsylvania to test his methods, and hired John Birkenbein, the president of the American Institute of Mining Engineers, as a consultant. By February 1889, Birkenbein was able to produce iron with over 60% purity. The ambitious Edison now sought to buy up mines himself and refine the metals for use in his own supply chain, making his whole enterprise self-sufficient in the process. After sending a team of surveyors to prospect potential sites, Edison acquired a large site at Ogdensburg in New Jersey, where he built an ore-crushing mill to reduce massive boulders to tiny fragments via a series of rollers, which were then separated by 3 groups of electromagnets. It's an indication of the breadth of his activities that Edison diverged from his usual work to develop new methods in this area. The formation of General Electric in 1892 had created a giant of American industry, but privately Edison was irritated that J.P. Morgan had removed Edison's name from the company name as a concession to Thomson-Houston. Edison's feeling that he was being sidelined in the new corporate entity was reinforced when Morgan appointed Charles Coffin of Thomson-Houston as the company's first president. Although he remained on General Electric's board of directors for a decade and continued to develop products for the company at his lab, Thomas did not attend further board meetings. Edison's alienation from General Electric prompted him to focus his energies instead on his mining pursuits. Then, in 1893, Edison suspended operations as a nationwide economic depression dubbed the Panic of 1893 led to a collapse in demand. Edison was forced to seek a loan from his father-in-law Louis Miller's company, which the latter managed to raise with some difficulty. Despite the financial troubles, at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, the Edison Tower of Light dominated the exhibition at the center of the Electricity Hall. Although a kinetoscope was not among the exhibits in Chicago, by 1894, Edison had established the Edison Manufacturing Company, which provided 25 kinetoscopes to the Kinetoscope Company, which then set up a bank of machines and charged visitors 25 cents to watch short films, the subjects of which included the strongman Eugene Sandow, Buffalo Bill, folk dancing, and dancing bears. Edison went on to sign a deal to record boxing matches. At $200 apiece, the kinetoscopes generated much-needed cash for Edison, who returned to his mine at Ogdensburg, which restarted operations in November 1894. Edison's desire to streamline operations and transform the mine into a profitable enterprise in turn led him to build a modest 2-story cabin known by the misleading name of the White House. Yet, despite all of his efforts in the quest for efficiency and productivity, Edison's ore remained less competitive than the large mining corporations in the Midwest, and by 1899, he finally cut his losses and closed down the mine. It was one of his few major business failures. In February 1896, Edison had just begun research into X-rays when he learned of his father Samuel's death at the age of 91. Although Thomas Edison's fame ensured his father had a comfortable retirement in his twilight years, his aloof approach to parenting and workaholic nature had caused problems with his children, and in the late 1890s, Edison's relationship with his 2 eldest children largely came to an end. His eldest daughter, Marion, had relocated to Europe, where she married the German army officer Karl Oskar Oeser in 1895. Although Edison gave his reluctant blessing, he stopped writing letters to Marion, who was forced to continue a one-sided correspondence. Marion's younger brother, Thomas Jr., struggled to emerge from his father's shadow and bitterly commented that there was no place in the world for 2 Thomas Edisons, In 1894, he had begun working for his father at the Ogdensburg mine, but was treated as an ordinary worker, and after leaving this position in 1897, he suffered a mental breakdown. Tom and his younger brother William each founded their own short-lived businesses carrying the Edison name against their father's wishes. Tom further scandalized the family when he secretly married 18-year-old actress Marie-Louise Touhy in February 1898, only to leave her the following year after she had an affair. It was only Tom's involvement with a fraudulent company promising health benefits from snake oil that led his father to seek a partial reconciliation and pay him a monthly allowance to prevent him from further discrediting the Edison name. Edison's family troubles were accompanied by a legal fight over his kinetoscope. Like many of Edison's former subordinates, William Dixon left the Edison Company in 1895 and joined a competitor, the American Mutoscope Company. While Edison hoped to continue developing the kinetoscope with one viewer per device, Dixon believed the future of motion pictures lay in projecting the images onto a larger screen. After Edison was granted his patent for the motion picture camera in 1897, he sued Dixon's company, renamed Biograph, for patent violation. In July 1901, the Circuit Court ruled in favor of Edison, but Biograph won an appeal 9 months later, prompting a countersuit from Edison. As a result, Biograph shifted its focus to newsreels and public events, while Edison's studio continued to make light entertainment. In 1903, Edwin Porter produced The Great Train Robbery for the Edison Company. While it was not the first narrative film to be made, it was a popular hit and occupies an iconic place in American film culture. As the 20th century dawned, Edison had abandoned his mining operations, but he developed the idea of using the sand created as a byproduct of his milling process to make Portland cement, a venture that proved more profitable than the defunct mine. Meanwhile, Edison was also intensifying his efforts in developing battery technology that would outperform traditional lead-acid batteries, which took a long time to recharge and was prone to leaking. Edison's solution was a storage battery which could be charged by running an electrical current to move oxygen ions through an electrolyte solution from a negatively charged metal plate to a positive plate. Once the battery was connected to power an electrical device, the ions would move in the opposite direction. After 3 years of experimentation with materials, Edison decided to use iron for the negative plate, a nickel oxide for the positive plate, and potassium hydroxide for the electrolyte. His work on his storage battery coincided with the early stages of automobile development, and he hoped that his batteries could be used in electric vehicles, which, far from popular perception, are not a new development of the early 21st century, but were actually in wide development at the beginning of the automobile revolution, before being eclipsed by petroleum-fueled engines. Edison bought several electric cars for his personal use, driven by his teenage son, Charles. In 1901, Edison obtained a patent for his battery and formed the Edison Storage Company. At the low price of $15 apiece, Edison's batteries were in high demand, but it soon transpired that they were prone to leaking and lost as much as 30% of their capacity after recharging. Edison's team made a number of enhancements to the durability and longevity of the battery over the following years. Over the same period, the engineer Henry Ford was working on a series of models that culminated in the Model T, the world's first mass-produced car, launched in 1908. Ford had first met Edison in 1896 as a young employee of the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. Edison had encouraged his efforts to develop a car powered by a combustion engine running on gasoline. During the intervening years, Edison came to regard combustion-engined cars as harmful to the environment and hoped that his batteries could provide a cleaner solution for automotive development, but the success of the Ford Model T ensured that combustion engines would become the preferred means of powering automotive vehicles. In 1912, at their second meeting, Ford asked Edison to design a battery and starter motor for him. Edison's storage batteries could not produce the voltage required to run a starter motor of a combustion engine, and lead-acid batteries remained standard in cars. Despite their failed collaboration, Ford's admiration for Edison was undiminished, and the two remained close friends. In 1913, Ford took the naturalist John Burroughs to meet Edison in Fort Myers, and the three would go on annual camping excursions until Burroughs' death in 1921. On the 9th of December 1914, an explosion in Edison's film inspection department caused a fire to spread throughout the Edison factory complex at West Orange, destroying many buildings, including the phonograph works. Edison had belatedly and reluctantly begun to record on discs in addition to his cylinders, and his records continued to be in high demand, and so he ordered the swift rebuilding of the factory to ensure that he could keep up. As a man with lifelong hearing difficulties, Edison held unorthodox views about music, cherishing clarity of tone over displays of emotion in songs. For this reason, he continued to feature folk music and marching bands in his records, while his rival, the Victor Talking Machine Company, began recording discs with the great operatic tenor Enrico Caruso. In 1915, soon after the fire, Edison was keen to demonstrate the capabilities of his phonograph by organizing so-called tone tests in concert halls. He recruited Anna Case, a 25-year-old soprano at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, to make records on his phonograph. In front of a live audience, Case and fellow opera stars recruited by Edison would begin singing in tandem with her recording before pausing every now and then to allow the machine to continue on its own, leaving the spectators guessing as to whether they were listening to the live performance or the recording. Edison's efforts to keep up with demand for his phonograph records faced a major challenge with the outbreak of the First World War in Europe. This quickly resulted in a British trade embargo on carbolic acid, a chemical used by military doctors to prevent infections, one which was also a key ingredient in Edison's records. The great inventor responded to this challenge by building a plant to make his own carbolic acid using benzol, a byproduct of steel making that he obtained from steel producers in the Midwest. The experience of the economic disruption of the war led Edison to believe that the United States should be economically self-sufficient. Unlike his friend Ford, a rabid anti-Semite who believed that the war was caused by Jewish businessmen in Europe and that the United States should stay out of it, Edison was of the opinion that the United States should be prepared to defend itself should the war spread across the Atlantic. Shortly after the sinking of the passenger liner the Lusitania, which was carrying many American passengers, by a German submarine in May 1915, Edison proposed an American submarine fleet to protect the East Coast. Not long thereafter, he signed a contract with the Department of the Navy to build submarines and battleships. Edison was appointed to head the Naval Consulting Board to advise the U.S. Navy on innovation and research. Although the Naval Research Laboratory proposed by the Consulting Board did not materialize until 1923, after the United States entered the war in 1917, Edison worked full-time as a defense advisor, leaving his son Charles in charge of operations at West Orange. Although Edison's fertile mind developed almost 50 different projects for the Navy, none of them were implemented, causing the by now 70-year-old inventor to express frustration at the bureaucratic processes within the U.S. government. In a further display of patriotism, Edison sold phonographs to entertain servicemen overseas at the discounted price of $60 apiece. After the war came to an end in November 1918, Edison returned to West Orange, which Charles Edison had managed competently in his absence. Now in his 8th decade, and having seen that Charles was capable of running the company, Edison was increasingly willing to leave day-to-day operations to his son and other subordinates. In 1923, he formally resigned as president of his holding company, Thomas A. Edison, Inc., leaving Charles as chief executive. However, when sales of his phonographs were threatened by the development of wireless radio technology, Edison stubbornly refused to abandon his attachment to his phonograph cylinders, and Charles spent much of the 1920s forlornly dealing with an increasing number of departures among staff and management who defected to more innovative companies. Edison's failure to keep up with the times did nothing to diminish his fame, and a 1922 poll by the New York Times named him as the greatest living American. Although Edison's companies only filed 31 patents in the decade between 1921 and 1931, a major decline on some previous decades, during this period he turned his mind to larger conceptual issues. While he had once enjoyed the financial support of the likes of J.P. Morgan, throughout his life Edison believed that Wall Street financiers were exclusively interested in further accumulating fortunes rather than in also developing American business and industry. He was a critic of the Federal Reserve and the gold standard, arguing that gold is of little utility and its value rests only on its scarcity. In a New York Times article from 1922, Edison proposed that the US dollar should instead be backed by reserves of agricultural and industrial commodities that had tangible value and utility, such as wheat, sugar, coffee beans, wool, and coal. Money created on this basis, he argued, could never lose its value. One particular commodity, rubber, was the focus of Edison's energies during the final decade of his life. In an age prior to the mass deployment of plastic products, rubber was essential for many aspects of life. Edison's interest in it began during the First World War, when import restrictions caused the price of the commodity to spike in the United States. Moreover, during his camping trips with John Burroughs and Henry Ford, they were often joined by the tire manufacturer Harvey Firestone, and the four discussed the issue extensively. During the war, Ford and Firestone began manufacturing their own rubber by implanting specimens from abroad, but Edison was determined to create rubber from plants native to the United States in the interests of national security. With the financial backing of Ford and Firestone, Edison established the Edison Botanic Research Corporation and collected specimens of rubber-bearing plants by consulting botanical scientists and sending his agents throughout the whole of North America. Much of the experimentation with rubber was carried out at Fort Myers, where the climate was more suited to rubber cultivation. After methodically extracting the rubber from each plant, Edison would record the characteristics of each sample, ordering his agents to return to the field to acquire the best-performing plants for further testing and cultivation. By the summer of 1929, he had narrowed down his search to 2 varieties of the goldenrod plant. This was one of his last major projects as a lifelong researcher, inventor, and innovator. In the autumn of 1928, the 81-year-old Edison was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in a ceremony at West Orange. Speaking via radio link, President Calvin Coolidge declared, quote, "Although Edison belongs to the world, the United States takes pride in the thought that his rise from humble beginnings and his unceasing struggling to overcome the obstacles on the road to success illustrate the spirit of our country." Edison's friend Henry Ford would also take steps to honor his achievements. At his birthplace in Dearborn, Michigan, Ford planned to build a museum dedicated to the history of American industry. As the centerpiece of the display, Ford proposed building a replica of Edison's Menlo Park complex, which had fallen into disrepair following the death of Edison's first wife. In October 1928, Edison and his son Charles joined Ford in obtaining original masonry from the site to use in the exhibit. When the museum was inaugurated on the 21st of October 1929, it was renamed the Edison Institute of Technology, with Edison and President Herbert Hoover as guests of honor. Oil magnate John D. Rockefeller and scientist Marie Curie were among the guests, while Albert Einstein called in from Germany. The climax of the ceremony saw Edison connecting 2 wires to reenact the lighting of his incandescent lamp, which in turn lit up the whole display. Within days of the ceremony at the Edison Institute, the stock market on Wall Street in New York City crashed, sending the United States and the world into the Great Depression. Meanwhile, Charles Edison was in the process of implementing a decision taken earlier that summer to close down the phonograph operations. While Edison was particularly sentimental about the phonograph and regretted the demise of the business, he was optimistic about his other experiments and was able to cultivate a goldenrod plant that yielded 12% rubber from its leaves. He planned to build a factory in Georgia on land owned by Henry Ford to produce rubber for the Ford Motor Company. But this would never see fruition in his own lifetime. In spite of his optimism for the future, Edison's physical health was in decline. For several years he had been suffering from diabetes, and in a curious approach to his health, had been subsisting largely on milk and cigars. He had developed sleep issues as well, and rarely slept for any more than 4 hours at night, something which caused him to frequently doze off during the day. In May 1931, he gave a radio address from Fort Myers to the National Electric Light Association, telling listeners not to despair at the latest economic downturn, stating, quote, "My message to you is to be courageous. I have lived a long time. I have seen history repeat itself again and again. I have seen many depressions in business. Always, America has come out stronger and more prosperous. Be as brave as your fathers before you. Have faith. Go forward. After returning to West Orange in June, Edison made occasional visits to the laboratory before he collapsed in his chair at home on the 1st of August. His health rallied for a few weeks, and he was able to take car rides outdoors, but by September, it was apparent that Edison was dying. In the early hours of the 18th of October 1931, Thomas Alva Edison died at the age of 84 at his home of Glenmont in West Orange. Thomas Edison is celebrated as one of the world's most prolific inventors, with 1,093 US patents to his name and a further 1,339 from other countries. Generations of schoolchildren around the world have been brought up with tales of Edison's inventions and scientific discoveries. Over his 6-decade career as an inventor, Edison's work spanned major innovations with the telegraph, telephone, phonograph, electric lights, energy distribution, mining, cement, storage batteries, and the production of natural rubber, among other industries and products. While Edison saw particular commercial success with the phonograph and the incandescent light bulb, many of his projects failed to meet his ambitious expectations. In recent years, Edison's legendary status has been challenged by critics who claimed that he took credit for ideas that originated from his collaborators or his rivals, and the unsavory methods he adopted to discredit Westinghouse and Tesla during the current war is a major stain on his reputation. There is some truth to this, and Edison was certainly a ruthless businessman who tried to undermine his competition. Yet he was also unquestionably one of the great visionaries and architects of the modern world. What do you think of Thomas Edison? Was he the great inventor and scientist of American legend, whose genius made the modern age? Or was he primarily an aggressive businessman who stole the ideas of others and exploited his own fame to destroy competitors and create market monopolies that benefited his own companies? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.